What are our arguments for switching to Signal? How do we convince companies to delete our data? What are our favorite aspects of GDPR? Our thoughts on Diode and Threema? Can Alias email addresses be unmasked? And is regulation really effective? Welcome to the Surveillance Report 197 Q&A, where we answer questions from our amazing patrons who allow us to make this podcast for all of you. You can view and join the questions on patreon.com/surveillancepod, or a couple of these questions actually came from XMR Chat, which we just unveiled last week, xmrchat.com/surveillancepod. So thank you to those people for contributing and helping us test that service out. And so far, it seems to be going well.
It's one-off Monero tips. So you can just send us Monero with a message if you didn't get the memo last week. And so those people literally just sent us a little bit of Monero and included a question, and that's where the questions came from.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you for clarifying. Okay, so our first question comes from our regular David Johnson, who actually has a few questions, but they're like top 3 style, which I kind of like. And the first one is, what would be your top 3 arguments for switching? Well, you said privacy arguments specifically for switching to Signal from a mainstream messenger like, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, or other popular messengers that are run by big tech surveillance companies. Specifically, what would our arguments be for non-techies? So basically, for those of us who already understand why privacy matters and what Signal brings to the table in terms of privacy and security, you probably already know, you're probably already convinced. First off, my argument, we've kind of touched on this before. I actually wouldn't focus on the privacy stuff too much. I definitely do throw it out there like, hey, by the way, cryptography experts the world over think that it's great. It's super private. The messages are encrypted, etc. But I tend to focus more on things like here in the US where WhatsApp is less popular, it's not SMS. So if you want to talk to friends and family overseas, you don't have to pay for an extra data plan. It's got GIFs, it's got stickers, it's got all these features. Those are the things that I tend to focus on. For the record, this goes not just for Signal, but for any encrypted messenger you want to get people to use. If you're trying to get your non-techie friends who don't care as much about privacy and security as you, I would focus on the features that it has to offer, because that's really what's going to win them over. People really like, and I know we've gone on this tangent 100 times, people really like their GIFs. They really like their voice messages. They really like their stickers. They really like those fun little features. And then everything else is just cherry on top. By the way, it's super secure. By the way, it's really private. By the way, it's got onion routing, or it's got disappearing messages. It's got this, that, and the other. I think Signal is the easiest sell because, again, it has all those things I pointed out. But whatever it is, like, find what it is your friends care about and highlight those features.
Yeah, like Nate said, it's personalized, I think. But I think just if I thought of average Joe or average Susan, I'm going to use privacy arguments because I'm not going to cheat like Nate did. No Facebook account requirement, I think, is a big thing because there's a lot of people who maybe still have their Facebook account just for that purpose, or they just don't want to feel like they need a Facebook account just to message other people. I think it being open source might not speak to everybody, but just being like, hey, yeah, it's open source. Like, it's free. You can see all the code. It's transparent. It's developed more or less. I know Signal is the most anti-community open source project there is, but it is for the community and it's built for the community. And then I'd say it's just a nonprofit. It's a nonprofit service. It's not surveillance tech. It's not designed to just give Facebook more money. So I think the philosophical stuff might help some people, but I overall agree with Nate. You can't sell privacy tools to people who don't care about privacy. They have to either just like the tool itself, or they have to understand why the privacy aspect matters. So these aren't the first things I would use, but those are my top 3.
Not to spend too long on each question, but I think those are really good points. Like, especially, I have met people who are like, oh, I only have Facebook to talk to like 3 people. Cool. If you can get them to switch to Signal, now you don't need Facebook. It is free. That's a plus. It's super easy sign up, especially for those messengers that are super easy. And yeah, with Signal specifically, like open source, nonprofit, like you said, so they're not trying to sell your data and make all their money out of you. They're not trying to paywall a lot of features. I think those are really big selling points. Those are really good points.
Top 3 favorite techniques to obtain compliance with your request when requesting data account removal from non-data broker companies that do not have a pre-made interface for it. I'd say be nice, be friendly and understanding. I feel like it's always helpful. I don't understand being a dick to customer support people because they are people and they're not going to want to help you and like go that extra mile if you're a dick to them. So don't be a dick. I'd say that's number 1 thing. I'd say explain your situation and be thorough. You always want to just explain like, hey, I have these concerns and this is why I would like to see if you offer this kind of service. Like, really explain your situation. Like, for context, even for things that are like really more serious that require a lot of info, like Techlore coaching and our applications that we use for that, some people send me things like, I need help. And it's like, okay, yeah, I don't know what that means. Like you need to like really expand and like really break it down because then other people can help you better. And then I'd say the third thing is don't be afraid to like follow up, stand your ground. If they say no at first, nicely go and say, okay, there is this law, you know, I'm a California resident, or hey, you probably comply with the GDPR and I spend time in Europe. I don't know, like if these apply to you, you know, don't do anything legally questionable, but feel free to push a little bit if they say no at first and just don't be afraid to kind of like not back down a little bit.
I especially agree with your first one because like one of the foundational tenets of social engineering is that people want to be helpful. They want to be agreeable. So like, yeah, if you launch straight into like, you need to delete my data or I'm going to hire an army of lawyers. Like, first of all, lawyers are expensive. I don't know if I believe you, but secondly, like, you know, you could have just asked nicely and they might have gone with it. Yeah, my top three, like you said, I used to live in California, a little peek behind the curtain. And when I moved out of state, I never got rid of my ID. I don't know if maybe they just never asked for it or I don't remember, but somehow or another, I ended up moving out of state and still had my California ID. And that was also when I got into privacy and I started doing like a lot of data removal stuff. So kind of cheating a little bit, but yeah, a lot of the time when they'd be like, oh, we're not going to remove your data. This was like right after the CCPA passed. And so I was like, actually, California resident, you have to delete my data. And I would send them my ID and usually that worked. You could look into your local state and see if there are any privacy laws. They are becoming more common and they're not very comprehensive, but especially if you did the time to research, in my experience, like one thing I have noticed lately is I've started doing a lot more like DMCA, like, you know, well, this is my data. This is my photo. You need to take this down. And a lot of the time, I think this stuff is still uncommon enough that companies would rather just like, whatever, dude, just fine. We deleted it. Just screw off and leave us alone. I think as this becomes more common, maybe we'll hit more resistance. But right now, I think that still works pretty well. And I think my last technique is one thing I've had success with, like Henry said, be polite. Tell them to cite their sources. Because like I had one service that I emailed them and I was like, hey, I moved out of state. I'm no longer in your state. I'm never going to be using your services again. Not anything wrong with it. I'm just not going to use it. Please delete my data. And they were like, oh, well, we have to keep your data for like 4 years or 7 years or whatever per state records. And I was like, okay, heard. Just out of curiosity, what state law is that? Like, I'm not familiar with that law. Would you mind sharing with me? And then literally the next email was, we've deleted your data. Oh, so there is no state law. You just thought I wasn't going to call your bluff on it. And then he said one more minor question, somewhat of a derivative of last week's question from Apricot. What would be your top 3 privacy rights that GDPR already offers that you would most like to see in the US? My first thought was right to be forgotten. I am a firm believer that we change a lot throughout our lives as people. Like Nate today is literally a completely different person than Nate 10 years ago. I think that's true of all. I think our core personality stays the same. You know, I don't think like any of us wake up one day and become serial killers. I certainly hope not. I don't think that stuff changes, but I think, you know, our tastes, our goals in life, our dreams, our job fields, like we change a lot throughout our lives. And I think we deserve that right to grow and change and to not be hounded by stupid mistakes we made in the past. I think having that ability to delete old content and have the right to be forgotten, I think is a really, really powerful thing, especially in this digital world of permanent records. We said last time also like cookie consent banners are kind of malicious compliance, but the idea of meaningful consent instead of just like, here's a 500,000 word terms of service legalese that we know you're not going to read because it would literally take 17 hours and you can either accept it or kick rocks. Like I would love to see. And I know that's still kind of a thing in GDPR, but you know, some more meaningful consent where people actually know what companies are collecting their data and what they're doing with it. And I think the last thing, I'm not a GDPR expert, so I don't know everything that it entails, but I guess maybe the last one would be like companies have to justify why they're collecting that data. They can't just say like, well, because you're signing up. They have to be like, no, we're going to process this data for advertising. We're going to process this data for improving a feature we offer. Like, I don't know, off the top of my head, I think those would be my top 3.
Yeah, good 3. I think your last 2 kind of go under the same bucket of right to be informed from the GDPR. And I think that's a really important one. I think my 3, yeah, I agree. Right to be forgotten is my number 1. Right to data portability is a really important one. I think that's why you're able to like download, you know, take out from Google. You're able to download your data from Apple. You're able to export things. And yeah, they're never perfect, right? They always try to make it difficult, but I'd say it could be a lot worse given how bad these companies are. And I think the GDPR is a big reason for that ability. And then I would say the right to lodge a complaint. That's a really important thing to hold companies accountable. The fact that consumers are able to, you know, complain to a company via some kind of mediator to handle it for them, I think is super important. And that's, I think, where laws really can empower individuals more than no laws, where individuals can't do anything. Next question is from Jared in Q&A 195, 2 weeks ago. The topic of an end-to-end encrypted zero-knowledge alternative to Slack was raised, and Henry, that is me, mentioned that he hasn't found any decent options. This is true. Have you tried out Diode.io?
Diode, probably.
Diode. As my mispronunciation of the term might suggest, I have not, my good friend, but I have just pulled up the website, and it looks interesting. I will say, just visually, it looks like they really try to emulate Slack. But no, I've never heard of this before, and I really appreciate you sending it my way, and it's something I'll look into. You've alerted me that it is closed source, but it looks like that's not necessarily true. They have a GitHub page, and there's a Diode client and a Diode server. I don't know if all their clients are open source or what that's about. This is not an endorsed service by myself. I haven't looked into it, but it's just a question. Yeah, I don't know. Do you see anything?
Well, my first red flag is when you scroll to the bottom of the homepage, what makes Diode different? Military-grade security, which is a completely meaningless marketing term designed to fool people into thinking it actually means anything at all. I also, when you click on how it works, which is at the bottom, there's docs. How it works, Diode's block quick TM, so trademarked algorithm, allows people and devices using the open source Diode network to define their security parameters. So I don't know, just proprietary stuff is never, I don't know if that's necessarily their encryption, but
yeah, it uses smart contracts and a decentralized
blockchain. I'm not a fan of the blockchain for, and this is not like crypto hate for the record. I'm not a fan of the blockchain for privacy and security stuff because the blockchain is great for transparency, but I don't like the idea of something living forever in the blockchain, especially when the whole point is like there's a search engine whose whole thing is like, we use blockchain based blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, why would I want my search terms to live on the blockchain forever? Maybe that's me misunderstanding how it works, but again, there's uses for it: decentralization, resilience, again, transparency. But when it comes to security and privacy, I don't know why I would want that to live on the blockchain forever.
They seem active on socials, so if they see this, if there's something we said that's incorrect, feel free to educate us if you're on the Diode team.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I don't see anything that makes me say no. Like, I don't see anything that makes me say absolutely either. Again, maybe I don't understand the value of blockchain for something like this.
And then they also ask about Threema. I just feel like I did look into Threema. I wasn't able to find info on like threads and kind of like keeping up with more project management type stuff with Threema, which I feel like something like Slack is better for, or even Matrix, to be honest with you. So let me know. I did check out Threema briefly, but it just didn't look like it had the kind of features I was looking for kind of like keeping up with like 10 different projects all at the same time.
It definitely does not. I do recommend Threema on my website, and I do have a Threema account, and I do have a couple people that I message there. So I do have I'm not like a power user, but I do have a rough idea of some of the features that Threema offers, and it's surprisingly sparse. Like, they just recently rolled out polls or something like that. They just recently added perfect forward security, which I don't even think is like quite the same way that Signal does it. They don't have threads. They finally rolled out reactions, but it's a very limited set of reactions. In fact, I think it's just thumbs up and thumbs down. I might be thinking of SimpleX only has like a handful of emojis and you can't choose different ones or more. It's surprisingly limited, both in the sense of like how long it's been around and in the sense of like they are marketed towards companies, like you said. But in terms of the technicals, they are open source. I have not heard anything bad about them. They do seem to have the technical chops to back up. Like, they are secure, but yeah, in terms of features, they seem to be very lacking, and I'm very surprised by that. And then you also said, could you keep us updated if you find any good end-to-end Teams apps? Yeah, I mean, if I hear or just find anything, I'd be more than happy if I remember to throw it out there, but it might be a while. So the next couple questions came from XMR chat. As Henry said at the top, for those who don't know, this is something new we're trying out where you can tip us in Monero and ask a question. It is publicly visible. So thank you guys for contributing some Monero, for supporting us and being part of that experiment. Our first question is going to come from Anonymous Kwaka, who says, is it easy to link aliases to the same identity? I imagine governments can request simple login and a non-ID for information, and a breach of their company databases would be discoverable on the deep web. So there's two parts to this question. I feel like in regards to your question specifically, you said governments can request data. That is true. One thing to keep in mind, simple login, I think, did move to Switzerland to be based in the same jurisdiction as Proton. I don't know where a non-ID is from, but I don't think it is the US, if I remember correctly. But yeah, that's a completely different threat model. I mean, yes, a government can go to anybody and request information. I think this is a good point. I'm not trying to downplay it. Like, yes, that is something to be aware of. All the information you put into Simple Login, as far as I know, is not encrypted. If they get a valid court order and they have to turn over that data, they can see any information you've given them. That could include what email address they're forwarding to. And yes, at that point, they will have a list of all your aliases, which they can then look through. And yeah, if there's ever a data breach, that information could very well, depending on what gets breached, end up on the dark web and could end up out there. So is it easy? I think that depends. I mean, I still imagine even in that situation, somebody would have to clean up this data or write a script that somehow organizes this data. It's probably not hard, but I think the first hurdle is getting it in the first place. At this time, Simple Login and AnonAddy have not had any of those data breaches. And again, what information would they be able to get that you've already given over other than just a list of your aliases and what email address it's forwarding to? Threat model, is that a concern? I don't know.
We always have to look backwards as well, not just forwards. The community is really good at looking forwards, and I think that's a really good trait. But if you look backwards, and what I mean by this is I think it's much better for people to be using aliasing services, which I use aliasing services for almost everything nowadays. It's much better to do that than to be reusing the same email on multiple websites. When you use an aliasing service, you're pretty much transferring trust to Simple Login or AnonAddy, and they do. It's now Addy.io also, and you do have to give over some control there, and you're trusting them with that, and that's something that you're relying on. But what you gain in return for that is you now don't have to trust hundreds of websites with your email account. And I think that's a huge benefit, because if you're reusing your email on 100 different accounts, all it takes is one data breach for your email to now be public and tied to your name. And so when you're using Simple Login, you now have hundreds of people who don't have your actual email, and a data breach means nothing for your email being leaked, because you can just close it and open a new one, just like that, snap of your finger. Or yeah, you are centralizing things a little bit with Simple Login. But what I'd come back to you with that is, if you're using just one email, you're centralizing things to that one email too. So if that email gets breached, then it's still kind of a similar problem. I think that there is always a downside. There is no perfect privacy service, but I think that the benefits you get from this are just fantastic. And if you look backwards and you see what privacy looks like without these services, there isn't much better, in my opinion. The only thing better than using aliasing services is if you generate your own email, like a brand new fresh email for every account you sign up for. And I think that's completely unrealistic. But I think it's great to be thinking about it, and I think it's good for people to acknowledge these issues with these services. And I also appreciate you thanking us for the informative podcast.
I just want to add on real quick. Michael Basil has tools where you can look up somebody's email address and find all the different social media accounts it's tied to.
And then the last question is from Anon. So you get to pick your name when you leave something on XMR chat, just so everybody knows. Aren't government regulations usually created by corporations and politicians working together? In my opinion, it seems naive to think a regulation can protect people's privacy. Yeah, I think there's definitely some truth to what you're saying. It is naive to think that regulations can, by themselves, protect people's privacy. And that's where I stand on it, and I think Nate's in a similar position. I'm not of the position that, companies and politicians are going to work together and be like, wow, we're going to really protect people's privacy. What I think regulations do when they're done properly, and they don't even need to be done fully properly for you to still get benefit from them, is they add the ability for you to hold companies accountable. I think that when you look at GDPR, we have a totally different digital landscape, not just within the EU, but globally, because companies have to comply with this law. I do think that certain countries have political systems that are less influenced by corporations than the US. I think the US is a worst case scenario, personally, in terms of that kind of
maybe not worst
issue.
Case, but it's pretty bad.
Yeah, you're right. There could always be worse, and maybe there are worse, but it's pretty bad. But I do think that even in the US, where we see countries like California have privacy laws, where there are still a mountain of privacy issues in California, I do not disagree with you. But you know what I can do in California? I can go online and I can just delete my data. And you don't have that right if you live in another state and you access the same website. You might be able to still do it because they're like, sure, we'll just roll out the feature for everybody else because it's easier anyway. But it's because of California's laws that you now have the right to delete services and all your data that's included in those. So you have California's laws and regulations to thank. Like Nate and I talked about, when you have privacy tools, you have education, and you have laws, The laws might still be lacking. They might not do much. We might still want to improve those laws, but getting them in there in the first place allows them to be improved, and they kind of set a baseline standard. But I think corporate influence is a real thing. I think that a lot of these laws are very washed down because of it. And I would love to see stronger regulations, because where we see those stronger regulations, we see more impacts. So I personally would direct more of your dislike towards these laws and regulations, towards corporate influence of laws and regulations, than the laws and regulations per se, if that makes sense.
I agree. No, I think that's it. I don't really have anything to add. Those were all our questions this week. So again, what are our arguments for convincing people to switch to Signal? How do we convince companies to delete our data? Our favorite aspects of the GDPR, our thoughts on Diode and Threema, our thoughts on unmasking alias email addresses, and our thoughts on the efficacy of regulation. So thank you guys for tuning in and asking questions. We really appreciate them, and we appreciate your support for the podcast. You guys are what keep us going. And again, there are now 2 ways you can be part of this Q&A. You can join Patreon, where it's only $5 a month. It's a nice recurring set it and forget it. And on top of it, you also get access to the Signal group. Again, we also have xmrchat.com/surveillancepod. Both of those links are in the show notes, of course. Again, we appreciate you guys keeping the podcast going and being part of what we're doing. So thank you guys again, and make sure you tune in this weekend for Surveillance Report 198 and whatever stories will pop up for that.